Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the 5th episode of our summer series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Ebenezer Obadare for a deep dive into current developments in Nigeria.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Ebenezer is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before joining CFR, he was professor of sociology at the University of Kansas at Lawrence. He is also a senior fellow at the New York University School of Professional Studies Center for Global Affairs and a fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. Author of numerous works on civil society and the state, along with religion and politics in Africa, his most recent book, published by the University of Notre Dame Press, is titled Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender, and Sexuality in Nigeria. Find a link to the book in our show notes. His next book, The Nigerian Century, will be published by Oxford University Press. Let's listen to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And today we're going to talk about the political and security situation that's going on in Nigeria. And we're happy to be joined today by Ebenezer Obadare, who comes to us from the Council on Foreign Relations. Ebenezer, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start off with giving our listeners a little bit of recent Nigerian history? So Nigeria adopted a new constitution in 1999, and since then it has grown into, by far, Africa's largest country, at least in terms of population. And its economic growth was very strong too, but has been waning a little in recent years. And this brings us to the last presidential election back in 2023, which saw Bola Tinubu win the presidency, but he did so with just 36% of the vote. So can you give us a sense of his politics, the politics in Nigeria currently, and what did he say he was going to do when he was running for the presidency?
Okay, sure. Happy to do that. Once again, thanks for having me. You mentioned one word in your introductory remarks, and that's the word constitution. And maybe that's where we should start with trying to understand Nigeria's recent history, because one thing that happened last week was that a group that calls itself Eminent Persons Group came together in Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory, and had deliberations over a couple of days about the 1999 Constitution. So 1999 was the year that Nigeria returned to civil rule after decades of military rule. It's interesting that 25 years into that experiment, there's still a lot of contestation and still of grumbling over the 1999 Constitution. And the idea is that that constitution was imposed by the military, that it was not something that was agreed to by Nigerians themselves. So it's very interesting that several decades into this, the Fourth Republic, this continuing experiment, there's still a lot of disaffection about the very structure that is supposed to hold that experiment itself together. Having said that, the man at the center of things right now is President Bola Tinubu. It's interesting that we're focusing on his personality because there's a sense in which you can tell the story of the Nigerian Fourth Republic through a focus on President Tinubu himself. It's been there since inception. Actually, it was there before Nigeria became a republic in 1999. It was part of the democratic exile, and it was one of the people who helped put Nigeria on the path to liberal democracy in 1999. It was governor of Lagos State. Lagos State is the southwestern part of the country. It's the richest state, period, in the entire federation. And he was governor for 2 terms until 2007. But what he has also done since then is that he's had his appointees in office in Lagos State following the completion of his second term in 2007. So he's extremely influential. But for him, President Buhari, who passed last week, would not have been president is one of the most influential Nigerian politicians over the last 3 or 4 decades or so. When he came to power 2 years ago, he promised to do 2 or 3 things. I mean, there were so many things he promised to do, but
Right.
promised to change the security situation for the better. He promised to substantially improve the economy, and he promised to give Nigerians hope in the future of the country. The extent to which he has attained success on these and other matters is, of course, a matter for debate, and I'm sure we can get into the weeds on that. But as things stand, so I was in Nigeria about 3 weeks ago, and I did a recent piece on my visit to the country. The consensus among the people I spoke to about a month ago was that it was a shoo-in for a re-election 2 years from now in 2027. But one of the things that has changed over the last 2 weeks, and I'm coming back to what I started with, is that there's a renewed disaffection in the country. One of the things that has happened is that the opposition that was once rudderless and seemed on the brink of total annihilation has found a new reinvigoration under the umbrella of what is called the African Democratic Congress. It's a party that has been in existence before now, but is now used as an umbrella by the major opposition figures. So over the last 2 weeks, what seemed like a shoo-in for President Tinubu is looking much more precarious. And it's going to be interesting to see how things unfold in the next 2 years, whether or not he wins re-election. So that's a summary of where we're coming from and where things stand for the country as we speak.
It seems like the first 2 years of his presidency were going okay, relatively speaking, if it seemed like he was going to be a shoo-in. So what has shifted in the last few weeks for this to look a little bit more like a close run thing for him moving forward?
So about 2 weeks ago, the president was in St. Lucia in the Caribbean. And he said one thing that he hadn't said throughout his 2-year presidency. He said, when I took over power, the country was in a state of bankruptcy. So he actually used that B word, that the country was near bankrupt. And I suspect that the reason he had been reluctant to use that word before was because he took over from a man that he put in office. So admitting that the country was economically on the ruinous path will have amounted to admitting that he did something that was wrong, meaning he put somebody who couldn't get things done in office. But he did. So over the last 2 years, the key questions for Tinubu have been, can you get that economy straightened out? 1. 2, can you rein in the insurgency, the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeastern and central part of the country? And 2.5, can you make sure that Nigerians everywhere feel safer? That those who are not dealing with the insurgency don't have to be looking constantly over their shoulders, thinking about random kidnapping, banditry, shootings, and everyday insecurity. To the extent that we can pass a judgment on an administration that is, I think, is only halfway there, 2 years into a 4-year tenure, I think most people will agree that in terms of the macroeconomics, things appear to have generally stabilized. However, for majority of Nigerians, for everyday Nigerians who do workaday jobs, who don't have the kind of exposure that people on the uppermost echelons of society have, life has been very, very brutal. So what has changed over the last 2 weeks is that an opposition that appears to have been decimated seems to have found its voice. And for the first time, the government appears to be rattled. If you are looking at the state of things 6 weeks ago, as I said earlier, you will have easily concluded that Tinubu was going to run away with it. Today, as I'm speaking to you, it does not look like that. It looks like, there is everything to play for. And for the first time over the last 2 years, one can imagine President Tinubu actually sleeping with one eye open, thinking of what the opposition might be up to.
So I want to dive into the security situation in a minute, but to hone in a little bit more specifically on the economics side of things. On the one hand, you say that at the macro level, things have sort of stabilized, but on the micro level, it's not playing out the same way. And one of the big things in a lot of petro states is the petrol subsidies that, they've been in the place for decades in a place like Nigeria. And he got rid of those when he came into office. And those oftentimes are a big drain on government funds. So what was the reaction to that? Has that actually helped to stabilize at a macro level the economy? And what are some of the other things that they have done successfully or unsuccessfully in the first 2 years?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think the removal of the subsidy on petroleum, that's one thing that every administration over the last 40 years has promised to do, military or civilian. I'm going to remove fuel subsidy because it's so much waste, it's used to
Yeah.
fraud and corruption. I'm going to set up a committee. We're going to look into how we're going to do it. And then when they think of the consequences for people and the fact that, how it is when you develop a bad habit, right? Sometimes you
Right.
think of the pain of walking away from that habit and you say, maybe I should just persevere in my bad habit. So one thing Tinubu did, which I thought was really smart, was on the day of his inauguration, he announced that the subsidy was gone. So he didn't say, I'm going to remove the subsidy. He said, I have already removed the subsidy. Now, the reaction was not quite pleasant, as you
I
might
can imagine.
expect.
Yeah.
Right, because it's not just that people started feeling the pain because they had to pay way more for energy, for petroleum, and for the other things that you have to do simply because you need petroleum. Members of the elite who are used to making money hand over fist from the old arrangement also did not like it. So for the first year, all the conversation was about that. And there was tremendous pressure on the administration to go back to the status quo ante and restore the subsidy regime. I think it's to the credit of President Tinubu that he did not do that. I think the idea also floating the naira, I think that was also, looking back in hindsight, I think that's a good thing. And I did a few other things as well that at the macroeconomic level, financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF gave him credit for. However, this is a very important however. Part of what happens in Nigeria is you give with one hand and you take with the other. The same president who said, because of fraud and corruption and waste, because I'm trying to avoid those things, I'm going to make sure that subsidy is removed, the effect of which was most felt by everyday people,
Right.
was the same president who approved SUVs for almost 600 members of the National Assembly. The price going to tens of billions of naira, right? So on the one hand, you are saying we need to be very frugal. Everybody needs to live within their means. Or as they say in Nigeria, we have to tighten our belt. But you are not doing that. Members of your cabinet are not doing that. Members of the elite are not doing that. That's number one. I think it was within the same period, right after he removed the subsidy, that the president purchased a new presidential jet for himself and members of his family. So it became very difficult to square the image of a president on the one that preached the gospel of austerity, and on the other hand, living as if nothing had changed and spending like a drunken sailor. So it became very difficult for everyday people to understand what the president was trying to do. And over time, a lot of resentment has built up because of that.
Yeah. And actions like that are easy pickings for opposition parties.
Absolutely right. So it's been out there, right? It just needed something to galvanize that, to bring that together. And I think for the first time over the last 2 years, the opposition finally got it done. They appear on the surface to have retired their own internal tensions, their own internal disagreements. For now, that appears to be the case, and they seem to have come together under a common umbrella. Whether they can sustain that for the next 2 years, I think is a different matter.
Right. So let's move away from the economy for a minute here and talk about the other major issue in Nigeria, and that's the surge in violence in the country in recent years. Nigeria is actually moved up 6th place on the Global Terrorism Index because of this. So, what's driving this wave of violence? There's always been intermittent violence for different reasons in Nigeria over the decades, but this seems especially bad in recent months. So, what's behind this,
Yeah.
and how is it affecting the broader political and social situation?
Okay. I'm happy to answer that. So I think the most important thing to understand here is the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeastern part of Nigeria. It's coming on almost 2 decades now. It started as, I think the general understanding at the beginning was that this is just the latest in a series of religiously freighted insurrections that you've had in the northern part of the country. You had the Maitasini revolt in the 80s. You take out the leader and then you put the group down and then you move on. And to the extent that there was always an element of the political in the grievance or in the grievances of these successive groups, the understanding among analysts and most Nigerians was that to the extent that you could respond politically to some of those grievances, that those groups will go away. I think we are beginning now to understand that Boko Haram is sui generis. Sui generis in the sense that it is not your conventional social movement, right? When I say that, this is what I mean. Boko Haram does not want good roads. Boko Haram does not want free and fair elections. Boko Haram does not want greater transparency, right? So if you have a group that is dedicated to those things, it's easy in quote, of course, to respond to those grievances and say, okay, we're going to do A, we're going to do B, we're going to do C in response to those things. What is fundamental and unique about Boko Haram is this. It does not want to reform the Nigerian state. It wants to abolish the Nigerian state.
Yeah.
Because it's a secular state, right? So that's one thing about Boko Haram that I think most analysts tend to gloss over that I think is worth understanding. And that's why for Boko Haram, there is really no difference between a Muslim who does not abide by the pieties of the group and a Christian. So far as Boko Haram is concerned, they're the same. And that's why the group does not discriminate in its target. Churches, mosques, police stations, government establishments, ordinary civilians, Muslim, Christian, farmers. That's the way the group operates. And it's important to dwell on that because, but for the foundation of violence that group has laid, there will have been no room for latter-day opportunistic groups, random kidnappers, bandits, people who just move on motorcycles, get AK-47 and unleash violence on hapless communities in different parts of the country, but mostly concentrated in the northeastern and the central part of the country. Having said that, that's just one slice of general insecurity in the country, insofar as what we're trying to do is understand insecurity. There's kidnapping that has nothing to do with Boko Haram, but that is enabled by the general lawlessness in the country. When it started, kidnapping was concentrated in the southeastern part of the country. But right now, it's become a nationwide occurrence. It ebbs and flows. Sometimes it will seem as if it's gone, government has been able to successfully deal with it, and then all of a sudden, it comes back. And then add to that, attacked by armed robbers who take advantage of the security problems in the country. And you have this very combustible situation where the state is constantly trying to impose its will and is regularly failing at doing so. I think in the latest piece I did, I quoted a figure by the Amnesty International that put the number of ordinary Nigerians killed by various jihadist groups over the last 2 years at more than 10,000. That gives you a sense of the very serious situation that the country is in.
So the government response to this, is it lack of capability on not being able to extend the security umbrella outside of the capital or big cities? Or is it corruption within the military or the police? Like, how is the lawlessness able to extend and continue?
It's a combination of both. And you've touched on something very important here. I did a piece a while ago, I think it was last year, and I called the Forever Counterinsurgency, in which I was examining these two things. The first problem is that you have a situation where the state no longer has absolute control over legitimate violence. It's an essential property, the Weberian property of the state, that it should be able to muster violence, deploy it, and hold its own against the
Right.
enemies of the state. One of the problems that Nigeria has had over the last 2 or 3 decades, and I don't think there is time to go into the reasons for that, but the military itself as an institution has become radically degraded, such that it knows more about politics than what soldiers or the soldiery in developed countries actually does. So it does not have the capacity to actually go after the insurgents and rein them in and impose law and order. But one of the reasons it's also been unable to do that is that even when resources are sourced from external agents from Western countries, such is the level of corruption in the country, in the armed forces also, that you can sort of see how those two things continue to mutually reinforce each other. So it brings us to this situation where, due to the way those factors combine, the Nigerian state is unable to do what it should do. But at the same time, you have this situation where the insurgency itself becomes something like a cartel, right? It's almost as if there are forces within the government and within the armed forces that want the insurgency to be there to continue because it's a source of money making.
Yes. Yeah.
That's why the country is in the situation in which it finds itself today.
So there's also been in Nigeria's neighborhood, there's also been growing insurgencies, coups. We've talked quite a bit about the Sahel on the podcast and sort of the coup belt from the past few years. So what role does that have in this increased insecurity in Nigeria? And how has the president been trying to work on regional foreign policy issues?
Yeah. So the way it's affected things, the situation in Nigeria, is that, so when Boko Haram started 20 odd years ago, it was the only case of religiously driven insurgency in that part of the country. Over the last 2 decades, that has changed. It's now one of several violent franchises sowing terror, not just in northern Nigeria, but across the Sahel period. There's Al-Shabaab, there's HISWAP, there's JNM. You have all these groups. There's Memuda, there's Nakurawa. You have all these groups with different doctrinal emphasis, but all united under the sign of jihadism. Right?
Mhm.
They may have their differences in terms of how they read particular parts of the Quran, whether they want to hold territory or not, whether they think women should be oppressed, how much they should be oppressed. You can read some fine line and say, okay, this one is different from that. But what they do agree on is the most important thing, which is that the modern secular state, as represented in varying degrees by Mali, by Niger, by Burkina Faso, by Cote d'Ivoire, by Cameroon, that state itself is haram. It should not exist. So it then raises a common challenge for how these countries implicated in this ought to deal with it. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, established in 1975, 50 years this year, has been the most important organization for resolving regional conflicts. And one thing that happened when President Tinubu came to power was that he became chairman of the organization. And as chairman of the organization, he swore that one of the things that I would like to see is a region where you have democracy, you have opportunity, you have prosperity, but you don't have military rule. Not long after he spoke, there was a coup in Niger, there were different coups, as you know. So he had his work cut out for him. So one of the things that he actually had to contend with initially was the coup in Niger. And he tried to mobilize other West African countries under the umbrella of ECOWAS to nip the coup in Niger in the bud. It did not succeed. But that problem has not gone away insofar as Niger itself has teamed up with Mali and Burkina Faso. They formed the so-called Association of Sahelian States, and they've changed their diplomatic direction. Now they have new friends in China, in Russia, friends who have no interest in good governance or social justice or liberal democracy, but who just want to use the word that is familiar to everybody now, transactional with those countries. So you then have this situation where all of these countries are facing common problems, but the institutional vehicle, ECOWAS, that would have been typically mobilized to deal with that problem, that institution is facing the most serious challenge to its own preservation and stability since it was established 50 years ago. So that's the situation in Nigeria and the rest of those Sahelian countries dealing with insurgency.
So another huge issue in the foreign policy realm is Nigeria's obviously largest population of a country in Africa. It's a huge country, important for a number of reasons. It's important for Washington, regardless of what this administration or past administration's view has been towards Africa and the policies they have in place. But we've also seen China move more and more into Africa in the past decade. So how has the president in his foreign policy been trying to walk that line between Washington and Beijing? And has he been successful to this point?
It's a wonderful question because you're asking me about something that is a source of continued frustration for me, which is I've been looking for a very clear articulation of foreign policy objectives from this administration, God knows, from the one before it and the one before it. I've not had it. Insofar as the response to the coup in Niger was a 2-3 month golden moment for President Tinubu, in that it allowed it to speak very clearly, very vigorously about the need to preserve democracy in the sub-region. It's an outlier, right? Because other than that, there is no clear statement of this is what Nigeria wants to do at this very moment, and this is why Nigeria wants to do it. If you're looking for the closest approximation to that, the last time Nigeria had a leader, interestingly enough, that had a clear foreign policy focus, that was under President Obasanjo between 1999, when we returned to civil rule, and 2007. Since then, I think it's been all the way down. Let me give you an example. So South Africa is one of the countries in the so-called BRICS.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not a fan of BRICS for reasons that we don't have to go into now. But when I saw a report, I think about a few weeks ago, the last meeting they had, when Nigeria had an observer status, I was like, no, that's not what Nigeria should be doing. I don't care what BRICS is all about. If you are in, you are in. If you are out, you are out. But for me, that in itself is an illustration of the current model in which Nigerian foreign policy is. There is no clear articulation of what Nigeria wants to do, why it wants to do it, and why that thing is important in the context of Nigeria's role in the sub-region and the region, and why it is important for Nigeria's leadership position, not just in Africa, but as the single most populous Black nation in the world.
Without any clear articulation of what their foreign policy strategies and goals are, has there been working with Washington on the one hand, working with Beijing on the other hand? Is that sort of the model that he's been taking up with no clear sort of strategic vision?
Exactly. The country is not saying to China, no, you can't come in, we won't do business with you. The country is not saying to the United States, we can't do business with you. Of course, it can't say that. Most Nigerians lean west and lean specifically America. So I don't see any administration that can do that. But at the same time, there's so much going on out there in international diplomacy. I mean, go back to Ukraine, right? If anybody hears anything about African leadership in the context of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, they are hearing about South Africa. They are hearing about Senegal, right? Nothing from Nigeria. where do you stand? Of course, Nigeria did vote to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but that was then not followed up with a significant statement, right? The most important statement we had was from the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations. I'm blocking on the name now, who said, look, there are good reasons why African countries should be disappointed in the way they've been treated historically by Western countries. But having said that, the right thing to do is to take sides with the US and its allies and condemn the invasion. Nigeria ought to have been the country doing that and rallying other countries. The fact that it continues to fail in that is a continuous source of disappointment for people like me who study Nigerian foreign policy.
So I'll get you out of here on this question. For international observers that follow Nigeria and follow African politics writ large, and for those in Washington looking to work with Nigeria or even try to get something out of it from a foreign policy standpoint, but also try to help it deal with its economic situation and the security situation in the country, what is one or two things that you would like to point out to those people?
Thank you for asking that question. You're asking me to do what I really like to do, which is boast about Nigeria. Never mind the frustration in my tone over the last 30 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Nigeria is a country that I love. Nigeria is a tremendous country. And you can sort of see what happens when Nigerians go outside Nigeria, right? They flourish in sports, in architecture, in medicine, in diplomacy, whatever. Nigerians are the single most successful immigrant group in the United States, right? So there's something there. The energy in the country is tremendous. And if you could just get out of its own way and do the right things, it's a country that, with all the right incentives in place, can become the United States' most important ally in Africa going forward. The thing that I think most people tend to miss about Nigeria is people tend to conflate their own wish for what they want to happen with a realistic assessment of the situation on the ground and what might happen. In addition to that, people tend to forget how much personality, region, religion, personal loyalty, and family, the role that those elemental things continue to play in how people make decisions. So when I talk to my friends, for instance, and they say, polling says, and the survey says, I'm always saying, don't rely on those polls for social reasons. Don't rely on those surveys. Get on the ground, talk to people. The role of personality in context where institutionalization is still radically incomplete, where institutions still don't have the kind of cachet that they have in more developed parts of the world, the role cannot be overestimated. And I think most observers of Nigeria and maybe other African countries continue to miss that as well.
All right, Ebenezer, thank you so much for educating us on the current issues in Nigeria. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Ebenezer for his time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.